What's going on, fish nerds? Welcome back, and today we're going to talk about the #1 best filter for breeding freshwater shrimp. Alright guys, so you already know that I'm in the middle of putting together a shrimp breeding rack. I'm going to have 6 10-gallon tanks that I'm going to be breeding freshwater shrimp in, mostly Neocaridina. I may get into some Caridina, but mostly Neocaridina. And with setting up that rack, I've got to filter all these tanks. So I'm looking at filtration, and I've decided I wanted to do a video for you guys to explain why I chose the filters that I did and what I think makes them better than the other available options. So when it comes to filtering aquariums, there really are several different types of filters out there that you can use to filter your fish tanks, and some of these are going to be better suited for shrimp than others. And probably the most common filter for fish tanks, especially for just casual fish keepers or beginner fish keepers, is gonna be the hang-on back filter. Now, hang-on back filters are great filters, you know, assuming that you have a brand that's not gonna fail on you. You know, if you've got a decent brand filter, they'll get the job done. You've got room in there for some mechanical filtration, biological filtration, and the way these things work, they have a little pump here that sucks water out of the tank up this intake tube into the filter itself. The filter itself fills up with water, and that water overflows out of this side back into the tank, you know, and gravity just puts it back into the tank after the motor sucks it out of the tank. And you know, it goes through mechanical filtration, it goes through biological filtration, all within this box. And you know, if it's working for your fish tank, that's awesome. And it does work for a lot of fish tanks, especially, you know, just a basic setup. You know, you got your mechanical filtration, your biological filtration, you got your water flow. That's really what you need for a fish tank. So these things get the job done, and they get it done very well. But when it comes to shrimp tanks, I don't really recommend a hang on the back filter unless you have an intake sponge. Now, an intake sponge is just a little sponge that would fit over this intake tube, so that the water would have to go through a sponge before it goes through this little strainer and then up into the filter itself. The reason for that is, you see this strainer has gaps in it. Those gaps are large enough for baby shrimp. And if you have a larger hang on the back filter, this is a small one. If you have a larger one, those gaps could be big enough for adult shrimp to get sucked up. And even with these little ones, your baby shrimp, if you're trying to breed shrimp, your babies are gonna get sucked up into this filter. And I'm assuming you've seen Finding Nemo. So that situation of little shrimp getting sucked up into this intake tube down here and going through the propeller blades of this motor is not an ideal situation that you want if you're trying to breed shrimp. You're not gonna get a very big colony if all your babies are getting minced. But that said, you get an intake sponge on there that will protect your shrimp from getting sucked up into this tube, so then you don't have to worry about that. So if you are using a hang on the back filter, that's fine, but you're going to need an intake sponge if you're going to run a hang on back filter while trying to breed shrimp. By the way, this video is sponsored by Flip Aquatics at flipaquatics.com, and if you need an intake sponge, you can get them there. And if you need shrimp to breed, you can get those there too. Also plants for your shrimp tanks, also hardscape for your shrimp tanks, also food, and all kinds of other good stuff for your shrimp tanks, and also nanofish now. So big thank you to Flip Aquatics for sponsoring the channel, and go show them some love, tell them I sent you, because we really appreciate them helping make this possible and supporting what we're doing here on the show. All right, so another type of filter that is really common with fish tanks, especially if you have a living room show tank, that kind of thing, or a larger tank, is going to be your canister filters. Now, this is kind of the same concept. You know, this one doesn't have the intake and outtake tubes attached right now, just because I just pulled it in here to show this. But kind of the same concept as the hang on back, in that there's a motor in the filter here that's going to suck water out of the tank through an intake tube into the filter itself. But then instead of letting gravity just pour the water back into the tank, there's going to be an outtake tube or a return tube that's going to spray the water back into the tank through a spray bar or through just a little return tube to pump the water back into the tank. So these are really great for display tanks, especially like in a living room setting, something like that. One, because they're quieter, because you don't have that splashing noise of the water pouring back into the fish tank. And two, because you can hide these underneath the tank down in the fish tank stand, so it's not like sticking out of your tank behind it or anything like that. So these are a little more discreet, both visually and audibly. So they're really great for fish tanks. For shrimp tanks, you know, especially if you're running a smaller shrimp tank, this is gonna be overkill for one thing. But say you're running a really big shrimp tank, you can use this. But again, you've got an intake strainer that's gonna have slots big enough for shrimp, especially baby shrimp, to get sucked up. You got a motor in here, and that's not gonna be an ideal situation. So again, you can use these in a shrimp tank, but you're going to want an intake sponge. And really, even for fish and a canister filter, I recommend an intake sponge anyway. A lot of people do. One, it gives you more mechanical filtration and biological filtration. Keeps these things from gumming up as quickly because it stops a lot of that hard or larger debris. And it also gives a little bit more surface for beneficial bacteria to grow on. So I recommend an intake sponge anyway, but especially if you've got shrimp in the tank and you're using a canister filter, get you an intake sponge. Another really popular type of filter, especially for larger tanks, is sump filters. Now these are pretty common in marine tanks, but in freshwater tanks, they're getting more and more popular, especially in your larger tanks where you're dealing with a huge bioload, dealing with big fish, that kind of thing, is sump filters. Sump filters work kind of like the reverse of a hang-on back filter, where instead of gravity taking the water out of the filter back into the tank, gravity is taking the water out of the tank. You have an overflow of some kind, whether that's just your tank is drilled, or if you're using an overflow box or PVC overflow, something like that, to allow water to flow out of the tank down into the filter, which is below the tank, and it goes through all of the filtration, and then a pump will pump that water back up into the fish tank where it can then flow back out again. So kind of the reverse process of this. Once again, your issue is going to be shrimp getting taken out of your fish tank into the filter, unless you can cover that overflow with a sponge to make sure that your shrimp stay in the tank. It's not something, if you're dealing with a shrimp only tank or a dedicated shrimp breeding tank, I really don't recommend a sump filter. Now, if you have a really large display tank and you've got thousands upon thousands of shrimp in it, and you're going to use a sponge on your overflow and you're using the sump just because it's a huge tank, that's one thing. But if you're using a 10-gallon tank or a 20 long, something like that, there's really no need for a sump filter. But again, you can, but you've got to make sure a sponge is protecting that overflow to keep any shrimp from flowing out. All right, now we're gonna be getting into our bread and butter of filters for shrimp tanks, starting with, of course, probably the first thing that popped into your minds, the sponge filter. Sponge filter is extremely popular with people who have fish rooms and have a whole bunch of tanks. Breeding tanks in general, even for breeding fish, these are super popular because fry are a lot weaker. And breeding fish, you have the same problem with breeding shrimp, and that, you know, little baby fish can get sucked up in that, and nobody wants that. So a lot of fish breeders will use sponge filters. I use sponge filters. A lot of people who have big fish rooms will use sponge filters exclusively because it's cheaper to power one air pump to run a whole bunch of sponge filters than it is to put hang-on backs or canister filters on a whole bunch of different fish tanks. So sponge filter, all it is, you've got this little uplift tube, you know, your air line goes down in here and bubbles come up through the tube, pulls water through the tube, water goes in through the sponge, out through the tube, and thus you get water flow through that sponge. You get a little bit of mechanical filtration, but not near as much as you would get with a hang on back or a canister filter. But you will get a little bit of mechanical filtration, just not near as good. But you will get your biological filtration, as you've got a ton of surface area in this sponge, and the water going through that sponge is gonna get filtered biologically by all of that. And you have no motors in this. There's no propellers, there's nothing in this that's going to chop up, hurt, maim, or otherwise injure your shrimp, baby or otherwise. So these are an excellent choice for breeding fish or shrimp. I highly recommend sponge filters, but they are not what I chose for my rack, and they are not my favorite filter for breeding shrimp, and I don't believe that they're the best filter for breeding shrimp. I think they're the second best filter for breeding shrimp. But my boy Rob at Flip Aquatics hooked me up with 6 Matan filters, and these are my absolute favorite filter for breeding shrimp. I've used sponge filters, and I am now using Matan filters. You guys know my Blue Dream tank is filtered with a Matan filter. I love these things for breeding shrimp. One, look at the surface area of this sponge, and look at the surface area of this sponge. This thing's bigger around than my head. This is a 10-gallon. This isn't like for a 40-gallon or anything like that. This is just a 10-gallon sponge filter. So all this surface area, I mean, just the width of it is almost as much as that. But compare how big around that is to how big around that is. So that's all surface area for biological filtration. And the way this works is really the same concept as the sponge filter. You have a tube, air goes up the tube, sucking water with it. Water comes back out here into the main part of the tank. That water has to get sucked up through the sponge back into this little back corner, because this is gonna be the side or the back of your fish tank. This is gonna be right here. So you just got this one little portion of water here. So all that water is gonna get sucked through the filter in order to go up through this tube and back out into the main part of the tank. So not only do you have all that extra surface area for bacteria, but the fact that the water has to get sucked in through this sponge in order to get sucked up into the intake tube means that you have better mechanical filtration than with the sponge. With the sponge, you're gonna be moving some of the water through there, but a lot of that debris and stuff can just continue to float around through the tank. And this still isn't gonna give you the mechanical filtration of like a hang-on back or a canister filter, but it is gonna be better than your regular sponge filter, because that water is gonna be moving in a direction through this sponge, then back out, and then back through the sponge. So this will do a better job of getting debris out of your water column than a sponge filter will. But again, there's yet another benefit to these Matan filters, and that is all of this sponge is going to be exposed to the inside of your tank. So all of this is one big feeding area for your shrimp to crawl on, for organisms to grow on, microfauna and biofilm and everything's gonna build up on this Matan filter, and this will just become one giant buffet for your shrimp to graze on. So it offers better mechanical filtration than your sponge filter. It's safer than the hang on back, the canister, or the sump. It's just as safe as the sponge filter. And you have more surface area both for bacteria and for your shrimp to graze on. And plus, if you're doing a rack where you're gonna put your tanks long ways the way I will, this is an instant black background. And plus, you've got enough space back here. You can put heaters back there if you need to run a heater. I don't, my room's heated. Plus shrimp, you know, generally are fine at room temperature anyway. But if you did need to run a heater or anything back here, you've got room to put a heater. If you wanted to put extra biological filtration and just, you know, throw some bio balls or some ceramic media or some lava rock back here, you could do that if you wanted to. You don't have to, you don't need to, but you can if you want to. So 100%. My all-time favorite filter for breeding shrimp. Easy, hands down, no contest. big shout out to Rob for hooking me up with these things. I didn't pay for them. You know, I shot him an email and I was like, hey Rob, I need some Matan filters. I'm doing a shrimp tank rack. And he's like, dude, I got you. So Rob hooked me up with these. So big thanks to him. Go support Flip Aquatics, flipaquatics.com. Go check them out if you're interested in these Matan filters. They also have sponge filters, and they also have the intake sponges for your canister and hang on back filters as well. So big love to Rob at Flip Aquatics, flipaquatics.com. Go check them out. So yeah guys, I hope this video was helpful, that you learned something. If you did not know about these filters, I'm glad you do now. And if you were on the fence about what kind of filter you should have for your shrimp tank, I apparently have to go let the dog in. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, I hope you give it a big thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button and hit that bell notification icon so that you don't miss next week's video. You guys are awesome. God bless you, fish nerds. I'll see you next time.